murder investigations from the case files of Lieutenant Joe Kenda.
You all will die today!
First, a family affair spirals out of control.
Oh my God, Dad!
There was no justice.
And Kenda must figure out why.
Whatever happened started right here.
Drop the keys out the window. Do it now.
You're being handled here at gunpoint.
Back off the car.
Don't do something stupid.
Then, a church of God turns into a house of horrors.
I am the Lord Jesus Christ!
They were praying for their lives.
He has an inherent violence about him.
Don't touch the knife, Richard.
He's not complying. He's just kind of staring right through us.
Don't do it, Richard!
In my business, you become a very light sleeper. I had a lot of people wanted to kill me, among other things. If I would hear any noise, I was awake. I was not just awake, I was wide awake. This is the way our life was. It was from one event to the next.
There's one thing that never changes: murder. A life has been taken. Their stories are now my stories. I never know where a case is going to lead, but I'll never stop until it's solved. Somebody has to look out for the victim.
If you kill,
It's the middle of the night. Larry and Kelly Schlott are asleep. When all of a sudden,
Larry, what's that?
Sounds like someone's at the front door.
Who the hell could it be at this hour of the night?
I don't know. I'll go check it out. Stay here.
Larry, what are you doing?
Larry picks up a baseball bat. He's ready to use it if he has to.
Louise?
But he's shocked when he opens the door. His neighbor Louise is crying and frantic.
It's Peter. He's been shot. I got 911. I need you to help me.
She knew that Larry knew CPR, so she asked him to come render aid to Pete.
Oh my God. Pete! 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 Oh my God.
Obviously has serious injuries.
Hold on, Pete. You with me, buddy?
Larry knows it's not working. It's not going to be able to save him.
A few miles north, Sergeant Joe Kenda is struggling with his own personal battle.
I don't sleep well. And I would often slip out the front door and be on my front porch and smoke a cigarette and think about all the things I've done and all the things I've seen and cannot unsee. And now here we go again.
Within the hour, Kenda arrives on scene and meets with Detective Skip Arms.
Hey, Skip.
Evening, Joe.
When I arrived on scene, there was very little activity going on. There was no traffic in the streets. It was really very quiet. So what we got?
We've got one shooting victim, shot multiple times. He left here in the ambulance alive, but we're not sure what his status is now.
He was shot in the front yard of his own home. Any of whom say they didn't see anything. So the only thing left for us there is the crime scene itself. You can learn a lot from a crime scene if you listen and pay attention. The crime scene will speak to you. It will whisper, but it will speak to you.
The victim was lying here when the medical arrived.
What's that?
Looks like a crescent wrench.
Let's make sure we have that dusted for prints. It would appear that the crescent wrench would have some role in this situation. It potentially could have either been an offensive or a defensive weapon.
We also got some casings over here.
How many?
5 total, 25 caliber.
We also found slugs in the yard, too.
The front yard appeared to be trampled down, so that indicated that perhaps there was some kind of struggle that may have occurred on the yard and then moved into the street. Whatever happened started right here.
My experience tells me there's a confrontation. Words get exchanged, threats are made, things get out of hand, and it ends with gunfire.
Which hospital was the victim transported to?
St. Francis.
Okay, Skip, I'll meet you there.
Works for me.
So for now, we've learned all we can here. We need to respond to the hospital where our victim is to determine A, his condition, and more importantly, B, that's where we believe we're going to find our witnesses.
Mr. Martinez was shot 5 times in all. Once in the shoulder, chest, stomach, and twice in the arm. He's in surgery now, but it looks doubtful. You know, another thing that you should probably be aware of is that the medics said they found him in his boxer shorts when they first picked him up.
Really?
The odds are he was either getting ready for bed or was already in bed. And when he was awakened by something, he came out in his underwear, and whatever happened next resulted in 5 holes in him that he didn't have a little while earlier.
Is his family around?
His wife and children in the lobby.
Yeah, thanks, Doc.
So we encounter first the wife of the victim, Louise, and she has 2 sons that are with her, Peter Jr. and Eric.
Excuse me. I'm Sergeant Kenda, and this is Detective Irons.
I'm Louise.
Do you think we could talk to you for a minute with you and your sons?
Well, I'd prefer if they had a little more time, but I can talk to you.
They're worried about their father. No point in even attempting a conversation with them.
Could you tell us a little bit about your relationship with your husband?
Well, we aren't technically married, but Peter and I have been together for over 15 years.
And everything was good between you guys?
Yeah, we had a good relationship. We actually work together, so we argue sometimes, but nothing serious.
Peter and Louise are both custodians at a building downtown. Doesn't pay a lot of money and it's hard work, but they get to work together and they enjoy that. And it's something that Louise really is happy about, that she gets to spend her days working with the love of her life.
So what exactly happened last evening?
Well, Peter and I were working and we got home around 10:30.
They went in to check on their boys, and they then made their way to bed.
I'm exhausted. What do we have going on tomorrow, babe?
Eric's got baseball in the afternoon, and I'm meeting Lucy for lunch.
All right, well, I think I'm just gonna go get some stuff for this weekend.
Wake up, Peter!
Who the hell's that?
He goes and opens the door.
Peter!
And it's his sister, Karen Michaels,
What's up, brother? You gonna let me in or what?
and her friend Lucia, and they are both extremely intoxicated.
Hey, Louise! Let's have a drink.
They had been at a party, and they came over there to keep the party underway.
Peter and his sister get along?
Sort of. I mean, Karen can be a real pain in the ass.
He was really sometimes super annoyed with her because of her manners and why she lived her life the way she did, of which he did not approve. He thought she drank too much and too often, and so on. So there's always this back and forth between he and his sister, and now his sister's at his front door.
At first, Peter was annoyed, but after a while, he started to loosen up and relax.
I don't know what either one of you are talking about.
I remember the old days.
No, you don't.
And they open some beers, and they turn on some music, and they're talking, and they're actually enjoying themselves.
I hope they do another block party. Yeah, I gotta take a leak. I'll be back.
Everything seemed to be going well.
What's that song?
You can change it if you want. The stereo's in Junior's room. Just try to be quiet. He's sleeping. You want another?
Yeah. You know me?
But all of a sudden, something happened.
And Louise heard some type of a commotion in Peter Jr.'s room.
You ass! Come on, Lucia, let's go.
Wait, why?
I said, come on, let's get the hell out of here.
What happened? Karen, what's wrong?
Let's get your husband.
Louise asked Peter what happened, and his response was, "Oh, that's just Karen. Good riddance, I'm glad she's gone." They then went to bed.
Not 30 minutes after we laid down, we heard people shouting outside.
Come out here, you ass. Peter, come outside, jackass.
Damn it, Karen!
Louise looks out the window.
Get your ass out here, you prick.
she sees two cars, a red car and a gray car. And there's a bunch of people out there, and she doesn't know who these people are.
What were they saying?
I don't know, but they sounded upset.
So Louise is going to call 911 to report this problem.
911, what's your emergency?
But before she can say a word...
Hi, there's... So I dropped the phone and I ran outside. The red car was gone and the gray one was pulling away. And Peter was just lying there in the street, all alone.
Do you think Karen could have shot Peter?
I don't think so. I mean, it's her own brother.
Okay, you said you saw a gray car. Do you know what type of car it was?
Yeah, I think so.
Having this information at hand, it's important for us to try to find the gray car. Sergeant Kent dispatch. And the occupants of the car. How do you put on APB?
So we offer the description of the suspect vehicle over the air to all officers, all points, bulletin, a suspect vehicle in what probably is a fatal shooting, consider armed and dangerous.
Luckily, it doesn't take long for an officer to spot the vehicle in question.
31 to dispatch.
Dispatch to 31.
Got eyes on that possible suspect vehicle. Go ahead and send me back up 2000 block of Corona Street.
We basically call it a felony traffic stop.
Driver, turn off the car and drop the keys out the window.
They fear that the occupants are potentially involved in a serious violent felony crime.
Do it now.
So the driver was directed to exit first.
Driver, step out, slowly. Keep your hands where I can see them.
He was a tall, black male, which didn't fit the descriptions.
Back up to the sound of my voice. Do it now.
Passenger, step out of the car. Do it now.
When the passenger steps out of the car,
Hands on your head.
she is Karen Michaels, sister of the victim. How convenient. So now we do have the right car, and we certainly have the right people. Now this situation has become dangerous. We're investigating the shooting of a father of two children, Peter Martinez. And patrol officers have just stopped a car that was seen fleeing from the scene.
Driver, step out, slowly.
Containing an occupant that was involved in a disturbance with the victim.
On your knees.
You're being handled here at gunpoint. Don't do something stupid.
Don't move.
Because of the short time frame between the shooting and the contact of this vehicle,
All right, stand up.
the chances were very high the occupants were involved in the crime.
Put your hands behind your back. Do it now.
So they had to be treated as potentially violent felony suspects.
It's clear. Clear.
So the two occupants were driven to the Detective Bureau. And once there, they were placed in separate rooms.
So what do you want to do?
Why don't you take Karen and I'll talk to this guy.
Works for me.
This individual identifies himself as Hank Michaels, and he is Karen Michaels' husband. And they have this car registered in both of their names.
Is someone gonna finally tell me what the hell is going on?
I was actually hoping that you'd be the one to do that.
We know Karen left the house upset. Did she go home and tell her husband that she had this fight with her brother? And did he come back over to the house in his gray car to avenge his wife?
How'd you end up going for a drive with your wife so early in the morning?
Man, I was sleeping. And Karen came home all worked up.
He says his wife woke him up when she came home. She said she got in a terrible fight with her brother, and she wants him to drive her to her mother's house.
And you didn't ask what went on between her and Peter?
No, they're always arguing about something. And besides, Karen was drunk, and I did not want to get her going. So I just drove her to her mother's house.
And as they were in the act of doing that, they're stopped by the police, and they got guns pointed at him, and he doesn't know what's going on.
So you never went to Peter's house at all?
No, not at all.
So there's Hank's story. Is that believable? Well, maybe it is. Think back to Louise. Louise says she sees Karen with some people. If this guy is there to defend his wife, he's the one knocking on the door.
So we try to find a record for Hank. He doesn't have a record. He's clean. At face value, there's no reason to believe he's being deceptive to us. So now our next step is to want to talk with Karen and see where that takes us.
Wake up, Miss Michaels.
What the hell are you doing?
I want to talk to you about your brother.
Which brother?
Karen Michaels is beyond drunk. She's loaded, and she couldn't hit the ground with her hat.
Your brother Peter? Peter Martinez?
What about him?
He was shot 5 times. Do you happen to know who did that to him?
I ain't talking until I get a lawyer.
Well, you're drunk, Karen, but you know enough to keep your mouth shut when you're in a jam. And guess what, baby cakes? You are in a jam.
All right. Well, we're still going to hold you for the time being.
Whatever.
So have we gotten very far? No. We have her, which is useful, but she has nothing to say to us. So now we need another pathway to find out who we're looking at.
So we felt that with some time passing, we would want to circle back and see if either Louise knew anything new or if by this point, either of her sons were willing to talk.
Have you received any word on your husband?
He went in for another surgery, so we're just here to get something to eat before heading back.
We were wondering if either one of your sons might be able to talk to us.
I really don't think Eric is, but Junior could probably talk to you. Junior, come here for a minute.
Peter Jr. is in high school. We think he's our best shot because he's a little older and maybe a little less emotional.
Can I have a seat?
And maybe a little more honest.
Junior, did you happen to see any of what happened to your father last night?
Yeah,
Can you tell us what happened?
I was sleeping in my bedroom when my Aunt Karen woke me up. Hey, Karen, what's going on?
How do you work this thing?
They had long lengths of speaker wire coming from the stereo in the son's bedroom to the speakers in the living room area. Peter Jr. says she wants to change the music, that she can't make this thing operate.
Hey, Karen! Karen, what the hell are you doing in here? Damn it, Karen, don't be disrespecting my house. Just look at my son!
The your radio's crap.
Karen, get the hell out of my son's room now.
Oh, shut up. What you gonna do?
He slaps her open hand in the face hard.
You're always walking around here drunk asking me for money. You don't respect no one. Get out of here.
Go to hell, Peter, you asshole.
She stormed out of the room and my dad told me to go back to sleep. But a little while later, something woke me up again.
Wake up, Peter!
He was awakened, so he gets up in a haze. Looks out the window, he sees his aunt, Karen Michaels. Her children are with her.
What are you doing, you crazy
And they are in an argument.
Did you see what happened?
Well, I ran outside and tried to help. Hey, Dad, what's going on? Off my property.
Whatever.
You, Karen? Get the out of here. Dad, Junior, go get my gun.
And the kid says, I didn't know what he meant because we don't have a gun. I guess he was trying to bluff him.
Hey, calm down. Calm down.
Apparently it worked because he saw Karen and the kids start retreating.
I went back inside because I thought it was over, but it wasn't.
Peter Jr. says,
Oh my God, Dad!
He heard several gunshots.
As the gray car drove away, Peter Jr. tells us that he was able to see the person that was in the passenger seat, and that is most likely our shooter. This is the break we need.
Did you recognize him?
Yes, I know who it is.
This whole search process in this investigation has to be to find a good witness, and we have just discovered a star witness. Now, who might this shooter be? We're investigating the shooting of Peter Martinez, who was gunned down in front of his own home.
Oh my God, Dad!
We've now learned that his son, Peter Jr., got a good look at the shooter.
So what's the guy's name?
Jake Ferguson.
So Jake is our dude. It isn't Karen, and it's certainly not her husband.
Who's Jake Ferguson?
He dates my cousin Nina.
The information that Peter Jr. could give us about Jake is he's a white male. He's about 18 years old or so.
He's only been in town a few weeks, but everybody classifies him as a bully, and everybody knows that Jake always has a gun.
Do you know where we can find this Jake?
I think he's in the army or something.
Thank you for talking to us. Yeah, we'll let ourselves out. Thank you. Thank you.
So we drive over to Fort Carson, and we find out that Mr. Ferguson is living and working on Fort Carson as a private E1 in the United States Army. So we have to elicit the cooperation of military police authorities, and they snatch up Jake Ferguson in a heartbeat.
Jake, I'm with the Colorado Springs Police Department. Do you know why I'm here?
I think so.
You can just see it in his eyes. It's obvious that he's scared. As someone who interviews and interrogates people, you need to gear your questioning based on what you see in order to be effective.
Am I under arrest?
Well, not at the moment. But I need to know what happened last night.
Okay. I'll tell you everything.
He didn't hold back. He really needed to get this off his chest.
I was at my girlfriend Nina's house, and we had a few beers, watched a movie, and then I fell asleep on the couch when her brother Rico woke me up.
Jake, come on, get up, man.
What's going on?
Come on, we've got to go.
Nina?
She's already in the car. We got to help my mom. You've got your gun?
Yeah, right here.
All right, let's go.
The brother Rico tells Jake they're going to go settle a fight between Nina's mom and her brother Peter Martinez.
He sees this as an opportunity to be an enforcer, to go help the family defend their honor, so to speak.
Who went to Peter's house?
Karen was hammered, so I drove her car. Nina, Rico, and their other sister Marta were in another car.
Peter, come out here. I want to talk to you. You ain't gonna hit our mom.
Get your ass out here, Uncle Peter.
I kind of hung back by the car while they went up to the house to confront Peter.
Come out here.
Peter jerked the door open, already in a rage.
Karen, what the f you doing, you crazy bitch?
You a big man hitting a woman, Uncle Peter?
Off my property.
And is screaming and yelling and using obscenities toward Karen Michaels and her children.
Man, learn to control your kids. You don't get to tell me what to do with my kids. I'm gonna kick you, Peter.
Beat his ass, Mom.
Karen.
Jake says a scuffle begins, followed by them falling down and rolling around in the dirt in the front yard.
Off me.
Beat his ass, Mom.
Off my property.
Jake said that Karen actually pulled Peter's pants off, leaving him just in his underwear. And then she started laughing at him.
You, Karen. Touch me again. Hey, do something. Dad, come on.
What's going on?
Hey, Junior, go get my gun. Get in the car. You want me to drive?
So they started heading back to the cars. I go to get in the front, but Karen insisted on driving.
Come on, damn it.
Because Karen was drunk, she was having difficulty getting the car started.
Get the hell out of here. What's wrong with you? Yo, back up the car. What are you, deaf? Are you drunk and stupid? Huh? I said back off the car, old man. What'd you call me? Think you're tough, white boy?
Jake says that he then sees Peter reach for his waistband and pull out an object he said was long and shiny.
Jake panics and empties that gun into Peter Martinez from a range of 3 or 4 feet. And every bullet he fires hits him.
Oh, damn. Oh, damn.
Give me the gun. Give me the gun. It's not like he wasn't asking for it.
Even though she was still pretty intoxicated, the fact that she didn't care whether or not her brother just got shot is pretty callous.
What did Karen do with the gun?
I don't know. I think she has it somewhere in the house.
Well, Jake, I appreciate you being honest with me, but I'm gonna have to place you under arrest. Go ahead and cuff him.
Peter Martinez has been pronounced dead at the hospital. So now it's no longer attempted murder, it's just murder. And it often results in violent death. That's a terribly sad thing in the case of Peter Martinez.
Coming up, an unhinged madman threatens the safety of an entire church congregation.
You all will die today.
This is St. Mary's Cathedral. How could this have happened in here?
In January of 1996, the church service was going on. It was Sunday morning, downtown.
How are you?
Near the end of the first service, an usher, Ron Meredith, is passing the collection plate, like they do every Sunday. But a man is sitting in the back and just seemed a little out of it.
These people don't know what the hell they're doing.
Give it to me. Excuse me, sir. That's not yours.
Give it to me, damn it.
Give me that.
There was a lot of confusion.
Sir, back off.
Ron is able to grab it, and the deranged man told everybody,
I am the Lord Jesus Christ. And you all will die today.
that made people very, very nervous.
Honey, call the police.
Later that morning, Lieutenant Joe Kenda is on his way into work.
Dispatch to X-ray 1.
The radio cracks and it said 1 X-ray 1. My call sign.
Go for X-ray 1.
Report of a shooting on Bijou Street. Redirect immediately.
Copy that. I'm on the way.
Ooh. On a Sunday morning when this town is either in church or still asleep? Pretty unusual. So I walk in that church, as I had done many times. I'm directed to the men's room.
Whoa.
This is St. Mary's Cathedral. How could this have happened in here?
Less than an hour before Lieutenant Kenda arrived on scene, chaos was just beginning to unfold at St. Mary's.
Hello, 911?
911, what's your emergency?
A man just tried to steal from our church, and then he threatened to kill us. And I'm afraid he's gonna try to come back.
We'll send units immediately.
Okay, thank you.
CSPD officers immediately respond, including patrolman Robert Benjamin.
In January of '96, I was in the patrol division.
We're here putting the call. Yeah, right here, we did. Is the suspect still inside?
No, he fled. Came in, tried to take our collection plate, and threatened everybody.
Where's the rest of the congregation?
They're inside.
Okay. Can you describe this guy?
Well, he's a pretty big guy.
Mr. Meredith told me he was kind of a stocky build, about 180 pounds.
As Ron is talking to the police, something interesting happened.
Yeah, I think I know this guy. His name's Deersmith. Richard Deersmith.
You sure about that?
Yeah, things happen pretty quickly in there, but I'm pretty sure it's him.
So now they're just looking for a description. They're looking for Richard Deersmith.
Give me a moment, please. Gulf 85 to dispatch. Trying to get an APB and a white male.
6'2", 180 pounds, named Richard Deersmith.
When officers call in the suspect's name,
Patrol, did you say Deersmith?
it immediately raises red flags.
That's right.
You have a pen handy?
So they find out that Mr. Deersmith has a rather extensive criminal record.
So apparently our suspect has been arrested 17 times in 3 different states. 2 of those were for assaulting an officer.
So you take that in sum, and this not only is a disturbed person, but he has an inherent violence about him. And he's physically capable of carrying it out.
We have his name and description out there. We're looking for him. You call us if anything else happens.
Thank you so much.
The police leave the scene and start looking for the suspect in the neighborhood.
He resides in the area. Witnesses in his neighborhood report they saw Deersmith leave his house carrying his large knife, which they say is routine for him. He's always ranting out loud and talking to himself or to invisible people, and they are very frightened of him. He's obviously deeply disturbed.
While officers are busy canvassing the area, the congregation picks up where it left off.
A reading from the first letter of St. Paul to the Corinthian brothers and sisters. Strive eagerly for the greatest spiritual gifts. Love is patient.
At that time,
Love is kind.
Richard Deersmith returns to the church. And this time,
I hear a sound of God.
he's got a knife in a sheath on his belt.
And if I have the gift of prophecy, to comprehend mysteries.
Deersmith did something kind of interesting and maybe unexpected. That he went straight to the bathroom.
Let me out of here!
The people who really deserve a lot of credit, the quick-thinking ushers.
We need to get the police back out here.
Hey! I said get me out of this room!
Within moments, Officer Benjamin and company are back on the scene.
God will punish you for this!
He's been going crazy in there.
Hey! Hey!
Does he have any weapons on him? Yeah, he's got a knife.
We're not going to get me out of this room!
Lots of thoughts going through my head, knowing we have a combative suspect in front of us.
Let's get out of here.
It was not the first time that he had been involved in potential violence towards police.
The 3 officers go to the door,
Somebody get me out of here!
unlock the door.
Hands up, Richard! Put your hands up, Richard. Hands up! Don't do that, Richard.
The ushers hear somebody say, "Don't do it, buddy. Don't do it."
Richard, no! Don't do it, Richard! Stop!
The church services continue after the dust settles from the emotion of this event. And it's no more than a few minutes after the officers leave, Richard Deersmith comes back in the church. He has a knife, and he's locked in a bathroom.
Hands up, Richard! Hands up!
The police open the door, guns drawn, because they didn't know what they were going to find.
Hey! Richard, stop!
The ushers heard a gunshot, and they thought, God, what is going on in there?
That's when the officers come out. And on their radio,
Need a medical down at the church right now.
a shooting officer involved. As I walk in, I see Richard Deersmith lying dead on the floor with a single gunshot wound in the upper left chest. And you stand there for a moment in that doorway and you look in this men's room and you think, why would that happen? We need to find that out.
Shortly after Kenda examines the crime scene, an investigator from the district attorney's office arrives to assist.
On any officer-involved shooting, the district attorney's office is called immediately.
And there's definitely still a lot to figure out.
Okay. Well, I'm going to need to talk to everybody involved.
Of course.
The district attorney's office conduct all police officer-involved shootings independently of the police department. They are investigating why is it necessary for the police to use great force to effect his arrest.
So we teamed all of our investigators and detectives up together and started interviewing all the potential witnesses.
The eyewitness interviews help investigators piece together exactly what happened when Deersmith returned to the church.
When the ushers at the church saw Deersmith come back,
I am the sound of God, or a flashing symbol.
with a knife,
And if I have the gift of prophecy,
they were scared. As they had the opportunity to lock him in the bathroom,
Hey! God will punish you for this! Hey! Let me out!
they found the miracle they were praying for.
When Officer Benjamin responded for the second time,
Oh, God.
he knew the suspect had a history of assaulting police.
I was worried about the safety of the parishioners that were in the church.
Somebody get me
He's
out
been
of
in
here!
there going crazy. He's got a knife.
let's go this way.
At the time, all three officers had their hands on their guns. They were ready for anything. They knew he was armed at this point.
Somebody get me out of here!
Please, hands up! Hands up, Richard! Put your hands up, Richard.
Deersmith has the knife. It's a 10-inch blade Bowie knife. Very large knife.
Turn around, Richard. Turn around, walk backward toward me. Turn around.
He's not complying. He's just kind of staring right through us.
Turn around, Richard. Richard, turn around and slowly walk back toward me. Good. Keep your hands visible. Okay, back up toward me. Very good. Hands up. Keep your hands up where I can see them. Nice and slow. Good. Good. Hands up. Do not put that hand down. Do not touch that knife, Richard.
There's something called a continuum of force, and this is how police officers are trained. You confront someone, you announce to them that they're under arrest. If they physically resist you, you are authorized by law to use whatever force is necessary to overcome that resistance.
Don't do that, Richard. Do not touch that knife. Stop!
I am the Lord Jesus Christ!
These people don't know what the hell they're doing.
Oh, God. Lord, let me out!
Richard, do not touch that knife! Don't do it, Richard! Richard, no! Richard, stop!
He reached for the knife. At that particular point, I knew I had no other option.
It's a very difficult thing to take a human life. It is. Policemen are trained. Officer Benjamin followed his training to the T. He handled that perfectly under the worst possible circumstances, but it is a devastating emotional effect on the officer.
It wasn't until after everything had calmed down that I started to think about what had transpired. You know, just playing over and over in your head, and you start to sometimes second guess yourself, well, what if I'd have done this different?
In this particular case, the ruling from the district attorney was that the police officer was justified in using deadly force against Mr. Deersmith.
No charges were filed, and the matter was closed. And Mr. Deersmith was left to a higher court.
June 2nd, 2010, began like countless other mornings in the northwest of England. Dawn arrived quietly over Cumbria, spilling a pale silver light across rolling green hills, dry stone walls, and narrow country roads that wound between sleepy villages as though they had never known urgency. A thin veil of mist drifted over open fields where sheep grazed without disturbance. Along the coast, the Irish Sea breathed in slow, rhythmic waves against dark rocks polished by centuries of wind and salt. Shopkeepers unlocked their front doors. Delivery vans rumbled through streets still half asleep. Elderly couples poured their first cups of tea while listening to local radio. Taxi drivers climbed behind their wheels, expecting another ordinary day filled with familiar passengers and familiar conversations. Nothing in the air suggested that before lunchtime, The county would become the center of one of the deadliest shooting sprees Britain had witnessed in decades. It would not begin with a masked stranger. It would not begin with an escaped criminal. It would begin with a man almost everyone thought they knew. For years, Derek Bird had been a familiar face around Whitehaven. At 52 years old, he blended so perfectly into everyday life that people rarely gave him a second glance. He drove a taxi. He exchanged polite greetings with customers. He laughed with colleagues outside taxi ranks. He knew shortcuts through narrow country lanes and remembered where elderly passengers preferred to be dropped off. To many, he was simply another hard-working local man making a living in a quiet corner of England. If someone had been asked to describe him the day before the shootings, they probably would not have used dramatic words. Reliable. Quiet. Private. Perhaps a little unusual. But dangerous. Almost no one would have chosen that word. That assumption would become one of the most haunting parts of this story. Because sometimes evil does not arrive wearing a recognizable face. Sometimes it drives the same streets every day, waves at neighbors, smiles politely, and disappears into the routine of ordinary life until one morning, without warning, the routine shatters. By the time police understood what was unfolding, Derek Bird was no longer simply driving passengers across Cumbria. He was driving toward people. Toward familiar faces. Toward strangers. Toward anyone unfortunate enough to stand in his path. And every passing minute widened the circle of tragedy. Imagine standing outside your home on an ordinary Wednesday morning. The sun has finally pushed through the clouds after days of unpredictable weather. A delivery truck passes. Somewhere nearby, a dog barks behind a garden fence. You hear the distant sound of traffic drifting through the town center. Nothing feels unusual. Then a vehicle slows beside the curb. You glance toward it without concern. The driver is someone you recognize. Perhaps you've seen him dozens of times before. Perhaps he even nods politely. Then, in the space between one heartbeat and the next, normal life disappears forever. That was the terrifying reality facing victims across Cumbria that morning. There was no warning siren. No public announcement. No obvious danger racing toward them. Death arrived disguised as familiarity. That is one reason the Cumbria shootings continue to disturb investigators, psychologists, and ordinary people even years later. The randomness was almost unbearable. Some victims appeared connected to Derek Bird through family, work, or personal history. Others had never spoken to him. Some were targeted deliberately. Others simply happened to be standing in the wrong place at the wrong moment. Their stories intersected with his for only a few seconds, and those few seconds changed dozens of families forever. The violence itself lasted only a matter of hours. The consequences have lasted far longer. Across Britain, newsrooms initially struggled to understand what was happening. Reports arrived in fragments. A shooting. Another shooting. Possibly connected. Another victim. A suspect driving a taxi. Gunfire in another village. Witnesses calling emergency services from different locations. Confusion spread almost as quickly as fear. Operators answering emergency calls heard voices shaking with panic. Some callers could barely describe what they had seen. Others were certain they had witnessed a traffic accident until they realized people were collapsing from gunshot wounds. Information flooded in faster than it could be organized. Every new report raised another urgent question. Where was the gunman now? No one seemed to know. Unlike crimes confined to a single building or a single street, this nightmare moved continuously. Every minute that passed created another possible destination, another possible victim, another place where someone believed they were perfectly safe. Police officers found themselves chasing not only a suspect but uncertainty itself. Roads twisted through villages, forests, and open countryside. Communication became increasingly difficult as reports contradicted one another. Some sightings proved accurate. Others were honest mistakes born from fear. Every taxi suddenly seemed suspicious. Every unfamiliar vehicle attracted nervous glances. Some residents locked their doors. Others hid behind curtains. Parents desperately tried reaching children at school. Family members called one another again and again, each unanswered phone increasing their anxiety. What made the unfolding horror even more chilling was the setting itself. Cumbria was not a place most people associated with mass violence. It was a county known for breathtaking landscapes rather than headlines. Visitors traveled there to escape crowded cities, to hike across rolling fells, to photograph peaceful lakes reflecting endless skies. Villages seemed frozen in time, where neighbors still recognized one another and local businesses depended on familiar customers returning week after week. People measured life through seasons rather than crises. Lambing season. Summer tourists. Autumn rain. Winter frost. Violence on this scale belonged somewhere else. Not here. Certainly not today. Yet history has an unsettling habit of choosing places precisely because they seem incapable of becoming symbols of tragedy. When investigators later reconstructed Derek Bird's movements, they discovered a path that cut through ordinary lives with devastating efficiency. Streets that had witnessed schoolchildren riding bicycles and retirees tending flower boxes suddenly became crime scenes. Quiet roads transformed into corridors of fear. Places remembered for their beauty became forever linked to unbearable memories. Years later, many residents would struggle to drive certain routes without remembering exactly where they had been when the shootings began. Memory has a strange relationship with trauma. People often forget entire conversations. They lose track of dates. Faces become blurred over time. But ask someone where they stood the moment they realized their world had changed, and details emerge with startling clarity. The color of the sky. The smell of fresh coffee. The song playing softly in the background. The expression on another person's face before anyone understood the truth. For Cumbria, June 2nd became one of those dates. A dividing line. Life before. Life after. As investigators searched for explanations, another unsettling question slowly emerged. How does someone arrive at this point? Not in a philosophical sense. Not as an excuse. But as a matter of understanding. Because people are rarely transformed overnight. Violence on this scale does not simply appear without a history behind it. There are relationships. Disappointments. Resentments. Financial pressures. Private conversations. Silent fears. Moments that seem insignificant until viewed through the unforgiving lens of hindsight. Some of those moments would eventually surface during the investigation. Others would remain impossible to verify. Even after countless interviews and extensive inquiries, authorities would conclude that no single event fully explained Derek Bird's actions. Instead, investigators encountered a tangled web of personal conflicts, financial worries, deteriorating mental health, growing isolation, and grievances that may have expanded inside his own mind far beyond reality. The picture that emerged was neither simple nor satisfying. There was no single answer capable of making sense of 12 innocent deaths. Perhaps that is why this case continues to fascinate criminologists and psychologists. Human beings naturally search for neat explanations. A motive. A trigger. One decisive moment. Reality often refuses to cooperate. Sometimes the truth is fragmented, incomplete, uncomfortable. Sometimes the only certainty is the devastation left behind. In the years since the Cumbria shootings, journalists have revisited the case again and again, hoping that another interview or forgotten document might illuminate what happened inside Derek Bird's mind during those final hours. Yet every attempt encounters the same invisible wall. The only person who truly knew why that morning unfolded as it did died before anyone could question him. Everything else is reconstruction. Evidence. Witness accounts. Patterns. Probability. The silence he left behind became another piece of the mystery. But while questions surrounding the gunman continue to generate discussion, the heart of this story has never belonged to him. It belongs to the people whose ordinary Wednesday morning ended without warning. It belongs to families who answered phone calls they would spend the rest of their lives wishing had never come. It belongs to survivors who still remember the impossible choice between freezing in disbelief and running for their lives. It belongs to emergency responders who entered scenes they had never imagined encountering in one of England's most peaceful counties. And it belongs to an entire community forced to confront a painful reality. Sometimes unimaginable tragedy does not announce itself. Sometimes it arrives quietly, hidden beneath the familiar rhythm of an ordinary day. On June 2, 2010, the people of Cumbria woke expecting nothing more remarkable than another morning. Before the afternoon had fully arrived, the county's name would be known around the world for an entirely different reason. This is the story of how an ordinary taxi driver became the center of a nationwide manhunt, how a peaceful landscape became the backdrop to unimaginable violence, and how one morning permanently altered the lives of everyone touched by its path. The answers are neither simple nor comforting, but to understand what happened, we must begin where every tragedy begins, before anyone realized that history was quietly waiting just around the next bend in the road. There is an unsettling illusion that quiet places somehow exist outside the reach of catastrophe. We convince ourselves that violence belongs to crowded cities, to neighborhoods already carrying reputations for danger, to places where flashing blue lights are common enough that people barely look up when they hear sirens. Rural communities seem protected by distance. The roads are narrower. The pace is slower. Faces are familiar. Doors are left unlocked a little longer than they would be elsewhere. Children still recognize the names of the people living 3 streets away. News travels through conversations before it reaches newspapers. Cumbria was one of those places. Nestled in the northwest corner of England, it is a county defined by contrast. Towering fells rise above quiet valleys. Ancient forests stand only a short drive from dramatic stretches of coastline. The famous Lake District draws millions of visitors every year, yet many of the surrounding towns remain deeply rooted in traditions that have changed very little over generations. People grow up knowing the same roads their parents once traveled. Local cafes remember regular customers without needing to ask what they would like. Taxi drivers become more than drivers. They become familiar voices, unofficial tour guides, listeners, and sometimes even friends. It was a place where routine carried its own quiet comfort. On a weekday morning, shopkeepers arranged displays before the first customers arrived. Bakers lifted warm loaves onto wooden shelves while the smell of fresh bread drifted into the streets. Delivery drivers waved at one another through windshields. Pensioners paused outside local newsagents to exchange comments about the weather, football, or the latest council decision. Teenagers hurried toward school buses, their backpacks bouncing against their shoulders as they laughed over conversations that already seemed more important than anything waiting in the classroom. No one looked over their shoulder. No one studied passing vehicles with suspicion. There was no reason to. That ordinary rhythm is difficult to appreciate until it is gone. Human beings rarely notice peace while they are living inside it. We notice it only after something tears it away. Years later, many residents would remember that morning not because it seemed extraordinary, but because it seemed so completely ordinary. The sunlight breaking through the clouds. The faint chill that lingered despite the approaching summer. The predictable flow of traffic moving through Whitehaven and neighboring villages. The sense that the day had already been written before it had truly begun. History has a cruel habit of hiding inside days that appear completely unremarkable. If someone had stood in the center of Whitehaven shortly after sunrise, they might have noticed dozens of taxis beginning their shifts. It was an occupation built on reliability. Drivers learned their communities through repetition. They knew which roads became congested at certain hours, which passengers preferred conversation, and which preferred silence. They knew where elderly residents lived and which pubs would be busy on Friday evenings. Over years of driving, they became woven into the social fabric of the towns they served. Among them was Derek Bird. He had spent years behind the wheel, navigating roads that had become almost instinctive. There was nothing glamorous about the work. Long hours. Unpredictable income. Endless miles behind glass, watching seasons change through the windshield. Yet it was honest work, and for many local residents, Bird was simply another familiar figure in a town filled with familiar figures. People recognized the taxi before they recognized the man. That kind of familiarity creates trust almost automatically. A taxi pulls to the curb. The driver smiles. A passenger climbs inside without hesitation. Routine does the rest. Perhaps that is one reason this case continues to feel uniquely disturbing. The vehicle itself represented safety and service. It was designed to carry people toward weddings, hospitals, train stations, restaurants, and home after late nights out. It represented movement toward ordinary destinations. On June 2, 2010, that same vehicle would become something else entirely. A moving crime scene. A symbol of unpredictability. A reminder that even the most familiar objects can become terrifying under the wrong circumstances. Long before investigators began mapping Bird's route, another map already existed. It was invisible. A map of relationships. Family connections. Professional acquaintances. Old disagreements. Quiet resentments. Financial worries. Private conversations remembered differently by different people. Every human life is surrounded by these invisible lines connecting one person to another. Most remain harmless. Some weaken over time. Others become strained but never break. Occasionally, however, those invisible threads tighten under pressure until they begin pulling in dangerous directions. The challenge facing investigators would not simply be identifying where Derek Bird traveled. It would be understanding the invisible map that existed long before he ever started the engine that morning. Looking backward after tragedy creates a powerful temptation. Every strange remark suddenly sounds like a warning. Every disagreement appears significant. Every unusual behavior feels like an obvious clue. Psychologists have a name for this tendency. Once we know the outcome, the past begins reshaping itself around that knowledge. Events that once seemed ordinary become loaded with meaning. The human brain desperately tries to construct a story in which catastrophe could have been predicted. Reality is rarely that generous. The people who knew Derek Bird did not spend years fearing that he would one day commit mass murder. If they had, countless opportunities would have existed to intervene. Instead, what emerged after the shootings was something far more complicated. Friends described him differently. Colleagues remembered conversations that suddenly felt unsettling only in retrospect. Family relationships revealed tensions that had existed beneath the surface for years. Financial concerns appeared more serious than many had realized. Some recalled moments when Bird seemed withdrawn. Others remembered him joking as usual only days before the attack. No single memory unlocked the mystery. Each recollection became one fragment of a puzzle that never formed a perfectly complete picture. And perhaps that incompleteness is one of the hardest truths in true crime. Not every question receives an answer. Not every motive can be measured. Sometimes investigators reconstruct events with remarkable precision while still remaining unable to explain the most important why. As the mourning continued across Cumbria, thousands of lives moved independently, unaware they were gradually drifting toward the same tragedy. A retired couple planned to visit friends. A father prepared for another day at work. A solicitor organized appointments. Taxi drivers gathered where they often gathered, exchanging casual conversation while waiting for fares. Cyclists enjoyed quiet country roads. Drivers headed toward meetings, grocery stores, and schools. Each decision felt insignificant. Turn left instead of right. Leave 5 minutes earlier. Stop for fuel. Take the scenic route. These are the invisible choices that shape every ordinary day. Most pass unnoticed because they lead exactly where we expect. On June 2nd, those tiny decisions would suddenly become matters of life and death. Some people survived simply because they arrived a few moments too late. Others found themselves in precisely the wrong place at precisely the wrong time. Randomness has always been one of the most unsettling elements of mass violence. People naturally search for patterns because patterns suggest control. If victims shared one characteristic, perhaps others could have avoided danger. If there were clear rules, Perhaps safety could be guaranteed. But randomness refuses to follow rules. It ignores preparation. It disregards fairness. It destroys the comforting belief that good choices always produce good outcomes. That morning in Cumbria, countless ordinary routines intersected with extraordinary violence for reasons no one could have predicted. While residents carried on with their lives, emergency services across the county operated under assumptions built from experience. Most calls involved accidents, medical emergencies, domestic disputes, or isolated criminal incidents. Procedures existed because patterns existed. Officers trained for events they believed might realistically occur within their communities. A mobile gunman crossing multiple towns, attacking both acquaintances and complete strangers over the course of roughly 2 hours, was almost unimaginable. The scale alone challenged every expectation. Information would arrive faster than certainty. Every new report forced dispatchers and officers to reconsider what they believed was happening. Was there one gunman? More than one? Were incidents connected? Was the suspect still moving? Where would he strike next? In those first confusing moments, every answer generated 2 more questions. Confusion is one of the defining characteristics of unfolding disasters. Television documentaries often compress investigations into neat sequences. One event leads cleanly into another. Detectives appear to recognize patterns almost immediately. The audience always knows more than the people inside the story. Reality feels nothing like that. Reality is fragmented. Voices overlap. Witnesses disagree. Radio transmissions interrupt one another. Timelines collapse under the weight of incomplete information. People make decisions without knowing whether those decisions are correct. On June 2nd, officers throughout Cumbria found themselves stepping into precisely that kind of uncertainty. Every passing minute mattered. Every incorrect report consumed valuable time. Every delay created opportunities for further tragedy. Yet amid the confusion, another truth remained constant. Somewhere on those quiet roads, a man who had spent years transporting passengers safely from one destination to another was now driving with an entirely different purpose. No one yet understood how far that purpose would carry him. No one yet knew how many families would soon receive devastating news. And perhaps most chilling of all, many of the people whose lives were about to change forever had not even met the man whose decisions were already steering history toward them. Across the United Kingdom, Wednesday mornings usually fade into memory almost as soon as they end. They are the kinds of days that leave behind no milestones, no celebrations, no headlines. Offices fill with the quiet rhythm of keyboards and ringing telephones. Construction crews gather around mugs of tea before beginning another shift. Children count the hours until school finishes. Retirees tend to gardens that have grown familiar over decades. By evening, most people struggle to remember anything remarkable about the day at all. June 2nd, 2010, refused to disappear that way. For thousands of people who had never even heard of Whitehaven, Egremont, Seascale, or Gosforth, those names would soon become inseparable from one of the darkest chapters in modern British criminal history. News broadcasts would interrupt regular programming. Newspaper presses would be redesigned before midnight. Television crews would descend upon quiet streets that had rarely attracted national attention. Helicopters would circle above landscapes usually photographed only for travel brochures and postcards. The contrast was almost impossible to comprehend. One moment, Cumbria represented serenity. The next, it represented fear. When terrible events unfold in familiar places, they leave behind more than physical damage. They alter the emotional geography of an entire community. Roads become memories. Street corners become reminders. Buildings remain standing exactly where they always stood, yet the people walking past them begin seeing 2 versions of the same place at once. There is the location as it exists today, and there is the invisible echo of the moment everything changed. Ask enough survivors of tragedy, and many will tell you the same thing. Time continues. The world continues. But certain places remain frozen. A stretch of pavement. A junction. A shop entrance. A quiet lay by. Nothing about them appears unusual to strangers, yet those who remember can never look at them without seeing something no one else can. The Cumbria shootings left dozens of places carrying that invisible weight. But before they became symbols of loss, they were simply parts of everyday life. That is why this story matters. Not because of the man who pulled the trigger. Not because of the statistics that would later appear in reports. But because every number represented a human life interrupted in the middle of something wonderfully ordinary. Someone was driving to work. Someone was preparing lunch. Someone was planning to visit family later that afternoon. Someone expected to return home before dinner. The future they imagined existed only a few minutes longer. There is another uncomfortable truth hidden inside cases like this. We often search for monsters because monsters are easier to separate from ourselves. They belong in horror films and history books. They announce themselves through obvious cruelty. They look different. They sound different. They give us permission to believe that we could always recognize them before it is too late. Real life rarely offers that comfort. People who commit extraordinary violence often spend years living lives that appear painfully ordinary. They pay bills. They greet neighbors. They complain about the weather. They stop at petrol stations. They stand in supermarket queues. They become part of the background scenery of everyday existence. That ordinariness is not an excuse. It is what makes these crimes so profoundly unsettling. Because if extraordinary violence can emerge from an ordinary life, then certainty becomes much harder to find. Investigators would eventually spend months examining Derek Bird's past, hoping to discover the point where everything began to unravel. They would interview relatives, colleagues, friends, acquaintances, medical professionals, and witnesses. Financial records would be reviewed. Personal relationships would be examined. Timelines would be reconstructed with painstaking care. The effort was enormous. The answers remained incomplete. Some evidence suggested long-standing family tensions. Some pointed toward financial anxieties. Others hinted at increasing feelings of resentment and isolation. There were indications that his mental state had deteriorated during the period leading up to the attacks, but no single discovery explained why one morning became different from every morning that came before it. Human behavior is rarely governed by one cause. Sometimes it resembles a river fed by countless small streams. Each stream alone appears insignificant. Together, they create a current powerful enough to reshape an entire landscape. Yet even that metaphor has limits. Because rivers follow natural laws. People do not. Every day, countless individuals experience financial hardship, family conflict, loneliness, humiliation, grief, or emotional distress without harming another person. Suffering alone does not predict violence. That distinction is essential, both out of fairness to those living with similar struggles and out of respect for the complexity of this case. The investigation would ultimately conclude that no single explanation could account for what happened on June 2nd. That uncertainty remains one of the most haunting aspects of the story. Perhaps there are answers that disappeared forever when Derek Bird entered the woods near Butte and ended his own life before police could question him. Perhaps some motivations existed only inside his own mind, distorted by fears and perceptions no one else fully understood. We will never know. What we do know is measurable. 12 innocent people lost their lives. 11 others survived injuries that would forever divide their lives into a before and an after. Families were shattered. Communities were transformed. A peaceful county became the setting for unimaginable grief. Those facts require no speculation. They are heavy enough on their own. As this story unfolds, there will be moments that seem almost impossible to believe. There will be decisions that appear irrational, coincidences that feel unbearably cruel, and questions that never receive satisfying answers. There will also be remarkable examples of courage from ordinary people who found themselves facing circumstances they had never imagined. Emergency responders rushed toward danger without knowing exactly what awaited them. Medical teams worked under extraordinary pressure. Witnesses helped strangers despite overwhelming fear. Survivors carried memories that words can only partially describe. True crime often focuses so intensely on perpetrators that everyone else becomes secondary. This story deserves a different approach. The man responsible occupies only a small fraction of the lives he destroyed. The victims occupied entire worlds. They were parents, brothers, sisters, friends, colleagues, neighbors, customers, and familiar faces whose absence would continue to be felt long after the headlines disappeared. Their stories did not begin on June 2nd, and they did not become meaningful only because tragedy found them. They mattered long before that morning. And that is where this journey must ultimately lead. Not toward fascination with violence for its own sake, but toward understanding the human cost hidden beneath every statistic. Because numbers create distance. Stories restore humanity. Before we follow the route that Derek Bird drove across Cumbria, before we examine the investigation that attempted to piece together those chaotic hours, we must first understand the world that existed before the first shot was fired. We must see the towns as they were, meet the people whose routines were about to be interrupted forever, and appreciate just how ordinary everything seemed only moments before history changed its course. The horror of June 2, 2010, was not born from chaos. It invaded order. It did not descend upon a battlefield. It entered peaceful streets. It did not target a place already accustomed to violence. It found a community that believed, like so many communities do, that tragedies of this scale happened somewhere else. They were wrong. And by the time anyone realized it, the first irreversible decisions had already been made. This is not merely the story of a shooting spree. It is the story of how normality can fracture without warning, how an entire county can lose its sense of safety in the span of a single morning, and how the echoes of just a few hours can continue to shape lives for decades. To understand that day, we must begin not with the gunfire, but with the people who woke believing they were about to live another ordinary Wednesday, never imagining that, before the sun had crossed the sky, the world they knew would never feel ordinary again. The morning unfolded with the quiet confidence of routine. In Cumbria, routine was more than habit, it was a way of life. The county seemed to move according to rhythms that had been established long before mobile phones, satellite navigation, or 24-hour news channels. Villages woke gradually rather than all at once. Curtains were drawn back one window at a time. Chimneys no longer filled the sky with thick smoke as they once had, but the comforting smell of toast, fresh coffee, and strong tea still drifted from family kitchens into cool June air. Along narrow roads bordered by centuries-old stone walls, tractors shared space with compact cars, delivery vans, and the occasional cyclist enjoying an early ride before the roads grew busier. It was easy to believe that life here moved a little slower than everywhere else. Not because time itself passed differently, but because people allowed it to. Drivers waved to one another even when they did not know each other's names. Shopkeepers greeted customers before the shop doors had fully opened. Conversations often lasted longer than necessary because no one seemed to be in quite the same hurry as those living in larger cities. Children recognized familiar faces walking through town. Pensioners occupied the same benches they had favored for years, watching the world continue at a pace that felt reassuringly familiar. Cumbria possessed something that many places quietly lose without noticing. Predictability. The roads curved where they had always curved. The hills stood where they had always stood. The sea rolled against the shoreline with patient consistency, unconcerned with human schedules or ambitions. People built lives around that stability. For visitors, the county represented escape. It was a destination where families arrived seeking fresh air, open landscapes, and the kind of silence that cities rarely offered. Photographers waited for sunrise over the lakes. Hikers laced their boots before climbing windswept fells. Couples wandered through market towns whose narrow streets still reflected centuries of history. Local cafes filled with conversations that drifted easily from weather forecasts to football results, from grandchildren to gardening, from holiday plans to everyday complaints that seemed important only because life was otherwise so peaceful. For those who lived there, however, Cumbria was simply home. The beauty eventually became ordinary. People no longer paused every morning to admire the distant hills glowing beneath soft sunlight. They drove past them on the way to work just as someone living in London might ignore the skyline outside an office window. Familiarity has a curious way of hiding beauty in plain sight. Yet on mornings like June 2nd, that quiet landscape still possessed an almost cinematic calm. Clouds drifted lazily above green fields divided by dry stone walls that had survived generations of storms. Sheep grazed without urgency, occasionally lifting their heads as passing vehicles disturbed the silence before returning to the grass. Along stretches of coastline, seabirds circled above the water, their cries carried inland by cool coastal winds. Nothing suggested that violence was already moving beneath the surface of an otherwise peaceful day. Whitehaven, where much of this story begins, had its own unique character. Once shaped by mining and maritime trade, the town had spent generations adapting to economic changes that affected many communities across northern England. Its Georgian streets overlooked the harbour, where fishing boats and pleasure craft shared space with reminders of a much busier industrial past. History lingered in the architecture, in the narrow streets, and in the conversations of residents whose families had often remained in the area for generations. It was the sort of town where people tended to recognize each other even if they had never formally met. A familiar face at the supermarket. A wave through a windshield. A brief exchange while waiting outside a pharmacy. Relationships overlapped in quiet, almost invisible ways. Someone's cousin worked at the post office. Someone else's brother drove a taxi. A schoolteacher knew the parents of half the children in the classroom. Connections spread naturally through the community until strangers became surprisingly rare. That closeness offered comfort. It also meant that tragedy traveled faster. When devastating news reached one household, it often reached another only minutes later because the people involved already knew one another in ways outsiders could hardly imagine. This would become painfully evident before the day was over. Among the familiar sights of Whitehaven were the town's taxi ranks. They rarely attracted attention because they represented one of the countless small services that kept daily life functioning. Taxis waited outside railway stations, shopping areas, hospitals, pubs, and supermarkets. Drivers stepped outside to stretch their legs between fares, sharing casual conversations about football scores, roadworks, local politics, or the unpredictable British weather. Most of them had spent years working together. Competition certainly existed, but so did familiarity. They borrowed pens from one another, shared stories about difficult passengers, complained about rising fuel prices, discussed local events. Sometimes they argued. More often they laughed. Like many professions built around long hours and repeated routines, taxi driving created its own informal community. People learned each other's habits almost without trying. Who preferred early shifts? Who always stopped for breakfast at the same cafe? Who avoided certain roads because traffic wasted fuel? Who never missed an opportunity to tell the same story for the 100th time? These ordinary observations became part of everyday life. Nothing about them hinted at what was approaching. Somewhere among those familiar routines moved Derek Bird. To understand why his actions shocked an entire nation, it is important to understand how remarkably ordinary his public image appeared. He was not known for explosive confrontations in the street. He was not constantly attracting police attention. He was not viewed by the wider community as someone capable of indiscriminate violence. Like many people, he lived a life that appeared far more ordinary from the outside than it may have felt from within. That distinction matters. Human beings often become experts at hiding internal struggles behind predictable routines. Someone can smile politely while carrying unbearable resentment. They can continue working while privately fearing financial collapse. They can exchange casual jokes while silently believing that everyone around them is laughing at them rather than with them. The public mask of normality is often stronger than people realize. Whether that mask accurately reflected Derek Bird's inner life would become one of the central questions investigators tried to answer after the shootings. Long before psychologists became involved, however, there was simply another working day. Customers climbed into taxis carrying shopping bags. Business appointments filled diaries. Solicitors prepared paperwork. Builders unloaded equipment. Schoolchildren settled into classrooms. Doctors began seeing patients. Every occupation contributed another thread to the ordinary fabric of the morning. None of those people knew they were living through the final hours of a version of Cumbria that still believed itself untouched by mass violence. The illusion of safety is rarely noticed until it disappears. Most communities possess unwritten assumptions. Violent crime happens elsewhere. Mass shootings happen elsewhere. Our town is different. Our neighbors are different. Our lives are different. These beliefs are understandable. Without them, daily life would become impossible. No one could leave home each morning if they genuinely expected catastrophe around every corner. Trust is essential to society. We trust that the driver approaching an intersection will stop at a red light. We trust that strangers standing beside us in a queue mean us no harm. We trust that the taxi pulling alongside the pavement is simply another taxi beginning another fare. On June 2nd, one of those ordinary assumptions would collapse. Not only for the people directly affected, but for millions watching from across Britain. Because when violence emerges from within the ordinary rather than arriving from outside it, people begin questioning routines they once accepted without thought. The familiar becomes uncertain. The predictable becomes fragile. Even years later, residents would describe subtle changes in the way they viewed everyday life. Some became more aware of passing vehicles. Others admitted they found themselves studying unfamiliar faces longer than they once would have. Many insisted that the county eventually healed. Few claimed it ever returned completely to the innocence it possessed before that Wednesday morning. Communities recover. They do not forget. That distinction would shape everything that followed. As the first hours of daylight stretched across Whitehaven and the surrounding towns, nothing visible suggested that history had already begun moving quietly beneath the surface. No sirens echoed across the hills. No emergency broadcasts interrupted local radio. No police officers raced through the streets searching for danger. The county remained exactly as it had appeared the previous evening. Peaceful. Familiar. Comforting. And completely unaware that, somewhere within its ordinary routines, the first pieces of an unimaginable tragedy were already falling silently into place. Beyond Whitehaven, the roads of Western Cumbria stitched together a collection of towns and villages that had spent generations sharing more than geography. Egremont, Seascale, Gosforth, Boot, and countless smaller communities were connected by winding stretches of road that curved through farmland, crossed quiet rivers, and disappeared beneath canopies of ancient trees before opening once again onto broad views of distant hills. To outsiders, the route could seem confusing, a maze of country lanes where every turn looked remarkably similar. To local residents, however, those roads were second nature. They knew every blind bend, every narrow bridge, every shortcut that could save a few minutes on the journey home. Taxi drivers knew them better than almost anyone. They measured distance not in miles but in memory. Every junction carried a story. Every pub had regular customers who preferred the same pickup point. Every estate had streets where children played football in the evenings and where elderly residents appreciated a driver willing to wait patiently while they gathered their shopping. The roads were more than routes. They were threads tying together countless ordinary lives. That Wednesday morning, those same roads carried commuters toward offices, parents toward supermarkets, tradesmen toward building sites, tourists toward scenic viewpoints, and delivery vans toward businesses opening for another normal day. No one imagined they were also becoming the path of a tragedy that would unfold with terrifying speed. If someone had driven through Whitehaven just after breakfast, they would have seen nothing extraordinary. The town centre moved with familiar purpose. Small businesses welcomed their first customers. The harbour reflected patches of blue sky between drifting clouds. Seagulls circled overhead, occasionally swooping toward discarded scraps left behind by early visitors. The air carried the faint scent of salt water mixed with diesel from passing vehicles and freshly baked bread from nearby bakeries. It was the sort of morning that encouraged routine rather than urgency. People walked without rushing. Shopkeepers chatted across doorways before returning to their work. Drivers paused patiently at crossings while pedestrians made their way across the road. The pace of life encouraged the comforting illusion that tomorrow would look very much like today. That illusion is one of the greatest gifts of ordinary life. We build plans because we believe the future will cooperate. We arrange lunch with friends next week. We promise to visit family at the weekend. We postpone phone calls until tomorrow because tomorrow seems guaranteed. Every ordinary decision depends upon an unspoken belief that the next hour will resemble the one before it. None of the people moving through Cumbria that morning knew how fragile that belief truly was. Among those beginning another day's work were professionals whose occupations rarely attracted public attention unless something had gone terribly wrong. Solicitors reviewed legal documents. Healthcare workers prepared for appointments. Delivery drivers organized parcels into efficient routes. Mechanics opened garage doors. Builders checked equipment before leaving for job sites. Each role seemed small when viewed individually, yet together they formed the quiet machinery of everyday society. One of those professionals was the family's solicitor, Kevin Commons. Like many solicitors serving local communities, his work involved matters that touched deeply personal aspects of people's lives: property, wills, disputes, financial arrangements, and legal guidance during moments of uncertainty. Clients often arrived carrying worries they hoped someone else could help untangle. Much of the work happened away from public attention, inside offices where conversations remained confidential and solutions were pursued through patience rather than drama. Few professions require trust more completely. Clients reveal financial details, family disagreements, private concerns, and long-standing conflicts with the expectation that they will be handled responsibly. It is work built on discretion. On June 2nd, that quiet routine would be shattered before the wider community even understood that anything unusual had begun. Elsewhere, another relationship quietly existed beneath the surface of ordinary life. Family. It is often said that no relationship is more complicated than the one shared by siblings. Shared childhoods create bonds that outsiders rarely understand. They also create rivalries, resentments, comparisons, and old wounds that sometimes survive decades. Brothers can spend entire lifetimes knowing exactly which memories to laugh about and exactly which subjects to avoid. Families carry histories invisible to everyone else. Derek Bird had an identical twin brother, David. To the outside world, the existence of an identical twin often feels almost symbolic, as though two people sharing the same face must also share the same life. Reality is rarely that simple. Twins grow into individuals with separate personalities, different ambitions, and sometimes deeply complicated relationships. Shared beginnings do not guarantee shared futures. Investigators would later examine the relationship between the brothers with extraordinary care, trying to understand years of family history compressed into a few devastating moments. They would uncover evidence of tension surrounding inheritance and financial matters, but like so many aspects of the case, those discoveries stopped short of providing a complete explanation. Conflict existed, yet conflict alone could not account for everything that followed. That pattern repeated itself again and again throughout the investigation. Every answer seemed incomplete. Every explanation opened another question. As ordinary residents carried on with their mourning, no one could yet see how these separate strands, family disagreements, financial anxieties, professional relationships, private frustrations, and an increasingly troubled state of mind would soon converge. Human lives rarely unravel in straight lines. They fray gradually. A disappointment here. An argument there. A fear that remains unspoken. A resentment allowed to grow in silence. Most of the time, those loose threads never become anything more than painful memories. People seek help. They reconcile. They adapt. They move forward. Everyday hardship is part of the human experience, and the overwhelming majority of people facing difficult circumstances never become violent. That truth is essential. Nothing about personal conflict or emotional distress inevitably leads to acts like those committed on June 2nd. The investigation into Derek Bird's actions never identified one inevitable path. Instead, it revealed a complex mixture of pressures and perceptions that, taken together, still failed to produce a simple answer. Perhaps that uncertainty is more frightening than certainty itself. People prefer stories with clear beginnings and endings because they create the illusion that future tragedies can always be prevented if the warning signs are recognized early enough. Real life is often less accommodating. Some warning signs become visible only after catastrophe has already occurred. Some are noticed but misunderstood. Others never exist at all. By mid-morning, Cumbria remained wrapped in the comforting rhythm of routine. Cars continued passing through villages where flower baskets hung from old stone buildings. Cyclists pedaled along quiet country roads bordered by hedgerows bursting with early summer growth. Elderly residents watered gardens that had taken years to cultivate. School lessons continued behind classroom doors where children concentrated on mathematics, literature, or history, unaware that they were living through the final peaceful hours of a day that would soon be remembered for an entirely different reason. The sky itself seemed almost indifferent. Soft clouds drifted lazily across patches of blue. Sunlight broke through often enough to brighten the fields before disappearing once again behind thin layers of gray. It was weather that invited people outdoors rather than sending them back inside. Nothing about nature hinted at the violence waiting ahead. That contrast has haunted many survivors of tragedy throughout history. The world rarely pauses before disaster. Birds continue singing. Traffic lights continue changing. The wind continues moving through trees. Life carries on until, suddenly, it doesn't. For those who would soon find themselves caught in Derek Bird's path, there was no dramatic sense of approaching danger. There was only another morning filled with ordinary expectations. A meeting to attend. A fare to collect. A relative to visit. A phone call to return. A quiet drive through familiar roads that had always led safely home. No one could know that those same roads were about to become the stage for one of the darkest mornings modern Britain had ever witnessed, or that within a matter of minutes, the peaceful landscape they had trusted all their lives would be transformed into a place forever marked by grief. Every community carries an invisible identity, something that cannot be found on maps or measured in census reports. It lives in shared memories, in local traditions, in the stories passed from one generation to the next. Cumbria's identity had always been shaped by resilience rather than spectacle. The people who called it home understood harsh winters, unpredictable weather, economic change, and the quiet determination required to build a life in a region where nature often dictated the rhythm of everyday existence. There was pride in that resilience. Not the loud, boastful kind, but something quieter. A confidence that people looked after one another. If someone's car broke down on a country road, another driver would usually stop. If an elderly neighbor needed groceries, someone would notice before they ever had to ask. If a family suffered a loss, meals appeared on their doorstep without invitation. It was a culture built less on grand gestures than on countless small acts of kindness repeated over years until they became second nature. That sense of familiarity created an environment where strangers rarely remained strangers for very long. The local butcher knew his customers by name. The pharmacist asked about grandchildren. Bartenders remembered favorite drinks without needing to ask. Taxi drivers recognized regular passengers from a distance. In larger cities, anonymity often becomes a form of privacy. In places like Whitehaven, familiarity became a form of security. People expected to recognize the faces around them. And more often than not, they did. This was one reason the events of June 2nd would leave wounds far deeper than statistics could ever explain. When violence erupts in a tightly connected community, it does not remain confined to those directly involved. It spreads outward through friendships, workplaces, neighborhoods, schools, and families until almost everyone discovers some personal connection to the tragedy. Perhaps they knew one of the victims. Perhaps they knew a relative. Perhaps they had shared a conversation only days earlier without realizing it would be the last. The distance between someone else and someone I know becomes painfully small. As investigators would later discover, many of the people caught up in the shootings were connected through those invisible threads that define small communities. Some relationships were close. Others were surprisingly distant, linked only by a mutual acquaintance or a familiar face seen around town. Yet every connection reminded residents of the same unsettling truth. This had not happened somewhere far away. It had happened here. On roads they drove every week. Outside shops where they bought groceries. Near schools their children attended. In neighborhoods that had always felt safe. The physical locations would remain unchanged after June 2nd, but the emotional landscape would never fully recover. Even years later, visitors often remarked that Cumbria still looked exactly as beautiful as photographs suggested. The lakes still reflected the sky with astonishing clarity. The fells still drew hikers from around the world. Villages still welcomed tourists seeking peace and quiet. Beauty survived. But for those who remembered, beauty was no longer untouched. Every community marked by tragedy develops its own quiet rituals of remembrance. Some people avoid certain roads entirely. Others deliberately drive them, believing that refusing to do so would allow fear to win. Flowers appear at anniversaries. Names are spoken softly during memorial services. Moments of silence become opportunities not only to mourn those who were lost, but also to acknowledge how fragile ordinary life truly is. Because ordinary life is exactly what was stolen that morning. Not only from the victims, from everyone. There is a tendency, especially years after a notorious crime, to view history through the lens of inevitability. Once the ending is known, every earlier moment appears to be leading toward it. The story feels fixed, as though no other outcome could possibly have existed. Real life is never experienced that way. On the evening of June 1st, there were still plans for the following day. Appointments had been scheduled. Lunches arranged. Errands postponed until Wednesday morning. People kissed spouses goodbye before bed, assuming they would see them again after work. Parents reminded children about homework. Friends promised to catch up later in the week. None of those conversations carried the weight they would later acquire. No one knew they were speaking final words. That is perhaps one of the most heartbreaking realities surrounding sudden acts of violence. Last conversations almost never sound important at the time. They are ordinary. See you later. Drive safely. Don't forget the shopping. Call me when you get home. Simple sentences that only become unforgettable because there is never another chance to say anything more. As this story continues, it is important to remember that hindsight offers a perspective no one living through those hours possessed. Investigators would eventually spend months reconstructing timelines with remarkable precision, identifying where Derek Bird traveled, whom he encountered, and how events unfolded across approximately 2 hours of relentless violence. They would analyze forensic evidence, interview witnesses, review communications, and piece together movements minute by minute. But on the morning itself, there was no completed timeline. Only uncertainty. Only fragments. Only people trying to understand something that seemed impossible. That uncertainty is where our story now begins to shift. The peaceful backdrop of Cumbria has been established. The quiet routines of its towns, the familiar faces, the roads that connected communities, and the assumptions of safety that shaped everyday life all formed the stage upon which history was about to unfold. The next chapter belongs not to the violence itself, but to the people whose lives gave those communities their heartbeat. Before they became names in newspaper headlines. Before they became victims in official reports. They were individuals with histories, relationships, ambitions, routines, and loved ones waiting for them to come home. Understanding who they were is essential. Because true crime is not only about explaining how tragedy happened. It is about remembering what tragedy took away. The headlines would eventually reduce the events of June 2, 2010, to numbers: 12 lives lost, 11 people injured, a gunman dead by suicide after a 2-hour shooting spree across multiple towns. Numbers are necessary. They help record history. They help investigators compare cases. They help governments examine policy. But numbers cannot laugh with friends over breakfast. Numbers cannot wave to neighbors across the street. Numbers cannot tuck children into bed, celebrate birthdays, argue with siblings, dream about holidays, or make plans for the weekend. People can. And people did. Until one ordinary Wednesday morning came to an end in a way that no one in Cumbria could have imagined. The county that had awakened beneath calm skies was now only moments away from entering history for reasons that would haunt generations. Before we follow the path of the gunman, we must first slow our pace and remember those whose stories deserve to be told not because of how they died, but because of how they lived. Their lives, not the violence, are the true foundation of everything that follows. Every victim in a true crime story risks becoming something they were never meant to be. A name in a report. A face in a newspaper. A number in a statistic. History has an unfortunate habit of remembering the person who committed the violence while gradually forgetting the people who lived full, ordinary lives before that violence found them. Years pass, documentaries are produced, articles are written, and the perpetrator's name is repeated over and over again. Meanwhile, the lives interrupted by those actions slowly fade into the background, reduced to brief descriptions beneath a photograph or a sentence buried inside an investigation. The Cumbria shootings deserve to be remembered differently. Long before June 2, 2010, became a date forever linked with tragedy, 12 people were simply living their lives. They woke up with plans. They carried responsibilities. They worried about bills, family, work, holidays, doctor's appointments, birthdays, and all the wonderfully ordinary concerns that fill an average week. None of them expected their stories to become part of British criminal history. The first lives forever tied to that morning shared something unusual. Neither of them was chosen at random. Before strangers would become victims, the violence began much closer to home. Family. There is something uniquely painful about crimes that begin inside relationships built over a lifetime. Friends may drift apart. Colleagues may change jobs. Neighbors may move away. But family connections often remain, however strained they become. They carry childhood memories, shared celebrations, old arguments, and decades of history that no outsider can fully understand. Derek Bird had an identical twin brother, David. For more than 50 years, they had shared a story that began on the very same day. From childhood onward, people had compared them, confused them, laughed about their similarities, and noticed their differences. Being an identical twin creates a bond unlike almost any other. It also creates expectations that the relationship must somehow be closer, stronger, or simpler than ordinary sibling relationships. Reality rarely follows those expectations. Like many brothers, their lives eventually followed separate paths. They became different men with different experiences, different personalities, and different ways of looking at the world. Over the years, according to the subsequent investigation, tensions had developed between them, including disagreements connected to family inheritance. Those disagreements were real, but the exact emotional weight they carried inside Derek Bird's mind could never be measured with certainty. Families argue. Families reconcile. Families disappoint one another. None of those experiences automatically lead to violence. That distinction matters because hindsight often tempts us to see inevitability where none existed. To relatives who knew both brothers, the relationship may at times have appeared strained, but few, if any, could have imagined how catastrophically that tension would end. David Bird was more than someone's brother. He was a man with his own routines, his own relationships, his own place within the community. He was known by people who had nothing to do with the later investigation. He had conversations that ended in laughter. He had ordinary mornings that blended into ordinary weeks. He had expectations for the future, however modest or ambitious they may have been. Like everyone else in Cumbria that morning, he believed another day had begun. Nothing in the quiet light of early June suggested that it would also become his last. The second person whose life intersected fatally with Derek Bird's was Kevin Commons, the family solicitor. If David represented the deeply personal world of family, Kevin represented something equally important: trust. Solicitors often become witnesses to the most significant chapters of people's lives. They assist with property purchases, wills, disputes, inheritances, and legal matters that families may discuss only behind closed doors. Clients entrust them with sensitive information, expecting professionalism, discretion, and careful judgment. Kevin Commons had built that trust through his work. He was not a public figure. He did not seek attention. Like countless legal professionals serving local communities across Britain, his work quietly helped people navigate some of life's most difficult decisions. Those who knew him remembered not a headline, but a person. A colleague. A professional. A familiar face. Someone who had earned a reputation over years rather than moments. That is often how lives are built. Slowly. Patiently. Through thousands of ordinary interactions that never appear remarkable until they suddenly end. The tragedy of June 2nd would eventually place Kevin Commons into newspaper articles across the country, but newspapers could never fully capture the decades that came before that morning. No headline can summarize a lifetime. No investigation can measure every friendship. No courtroom can calculate the absence left behind when one person no longer returns home. Those first two victims remind us of something essential before the wider violence even begins. This was not simply an attack upon strangers. It was an explosion that originated within relationships already carrying years of history. Exactly what Derek Bird believed in those final hours before the shootings remains impossible to establish with certainty. Investigators later concluded that a combination of personal grievances, financial worries, family conflict, and a deteriorating mental state likely influenced his actions. But influence is not explanation. The private thoughts that accompanied his decisions disappeared with him. What remained were consequences. Irreversible consequences. Yet this story extends far beyond those first two lives. Because once the violence moved beyond personal relationships, it entered another world entirely. The world of chance. Some victims had crossed paths with Derek Bird before. Others almost certainly had not. Some recognized the taxi approaching them. Others barely had time to register what was happening. Each life interrupted that morning possessed its own history stretching back decades before June 2nd. Among those later killed was a dairy farmer whose days revolved around the demanding rhythm of agricultural life. Farming is rarely a profession that allows leisurely mornings. Animals do not recognize weekends or holidays. Work begins before sunrise more often than not, shaped by weather, seasons, and responsibility rather than convenience. It is a life requiring endurance, patience, and resilience, qualities that often pass quietly from one generation to the next. Elsewhere, another victim had spent years working within the local community, becoming known not because of fame but because of familiarity. In towns like those scattered across Cumbria, familiarity carries enormous value. People remember kindness. They remember dependable service. They remember the person who always smiled, who asked about family, who stopped for a brief conversation instead of rushing away. Those memories become precious after loss. They transform ordinary moments into treasured ones. A casual greeting once forgotten becomes impossible to forget. A routine conversation suddenly becomes the final conversation. Families often speak of grief as though time freezes. In reality, time continues relentlessly. Shops reopen. Traffic returns. Children grow older. Seasons change. Yet for those left behind, part of life remains anchored to the day everything changed. Birthdays arrive carrying absence. Christmas dinner includes an empty chair. Anniversaries become quieter. Photographs begin carrying more emotional weight than anyone ever expected. These are the consequences that rarely appear in official reports. Investigations count evidence. Families count memories. Those two measurements can never truly be compared. As news of the shootings spread throughout Cumbria, relatives began experiencing one of the cruelest aspects of unfolding tragedy. Uncertainty. Phones rang unanswered. Messages received no reply. Rumors moved faster than confirmed information. Some people desperately reassured themselves that loved ones had simply left their phones at home. Others convinced themselves that reports must be exaggerated. Hope often survives long after reason begins whispering otherwise. Hospitals became places of unbearable waiting. Police officers prepared to deliver news no family ever wishes to receive. Behind every front door where that news arrived, another private world collapsed. Children became children without parents. Parents buried sons. Siblings mourned brothers. Friends searched for words that did not exist. Communities attempted to comfort losses too profound for language. The victims of the Cumbria shootings did not share identical backgrounds, occupations, or ages. What united them was something far simpler. They were living ordinary lives until those lives were violently interrupted. That ordinary humanity deserves far more attention than the man who took it away. Because in the end, the lasting legacy of June 2nd should never be measured solely by the horror that occurred. It should also be measured by the lives that mattered long before that morning and by the countless people who continue to carry their memory forward, long after the headlines have faded. If you walk through a small town long enough, you begin to notice something that statistics can never explain. People are connected in quiet, almost invisible ways. The woman serving coffee knows the postman by his first name. The mechanic once coached the local youth football team. The pharmacist remembers which customer always asks after his elderly mother. The taxi driver recognizes the schoolteacher who has taken the same ride home every Friday for years. Those connections rarely attract attention because they feel ordinary. They are the threads that hold a community together. On June 2nd, 2010, many of those threads were torn apart at once. For the families left behind, the victims were never defined by the way they died. They were remembered by the countless ordinary moments that came before. A familiar laugh echoing across a family dinner. The habit of arriving 5 minutes early for every appointment. The quiet ritual of reading the newspaper with a cup of tea before anyone else in the house had woken up. The jokes repeated every Christmas despite everyone already knowing the punchline. Grief does something unusual to memory. It rarely clings to dramatic events. Instead, it preserves the smallest details. The sound of footsteps in the hallway. The way someone folded their coat over the back of a chair. The familiar greeting shouted from the front door after returning home from work. Those are the moments families search for long after a loved one is gone. No investigation can record them. No forensic report can preserve them. Yet they are often what matter most. As police worked to identify victims and notify relatives, ordinary homes across Cumbria became places of unimaginable silence. There is no training for the moment a police officer knocks unexpectedly on the front door. No family rehearses the conversation that follows. Before the words are even spoken, something inside people often recognizes that life is about to divide into two chapters. Before. After. Everything that once felt permanent suddenly becomes memory. Across the county, telephones rang with increasing urgency. Friends called friends. Brothers called sisters. Parents tried reaching children. Employers attempted to account for workers who had failed to arrive. Rumors spread through workplaces before official information could catch up. Every unanswered phone seemed heavier than the last. Someone had seen police vehicles. Someone else had heard there had been a shooting. Another person insisted there were several shootings. No one knew exactly what was true. That uncertainty became its own form of suffering. While emergency services struggled to understand the scale of what was unfolding, countless families were trapped inside the unbearable space between hope and confirmation. Hope has remarkable endurance. People cling to the smallest possibilities. Perhaps the phone battery had died. Perhaps there was no signal. Perhaps they had simply stopped to help someone else. The human mind searches desperately for ordinary explanations because the extraordinary feels impossible to accept. Many families would later remember those hours as the longest of their lives. Time seemed to slow. Every passing minute invited another frightening possibility. Every news update created fresh anxiety. The television no longer felt like entertainment. It became something to fear. Every new report might contain the name they prayed they would never hear. One of the quiet tragedies surrounding cases like Cumbria is that the victims never had an opportunity to become extraordinary in the public imagination before they were taken from it. They were not celebrities. They did not live lives that attracted national attention. Their importance existed entirely within the circles of people who loved them. And perhaps that makes their stories even more important. Because most people leave the world exactly that way. Known deeply by a few. Recognized casually by many. Completely unknown to millions. Yet every human life carries a universe of experiences invisible to strangers. A favorite place to walk. A song that always brought back memories. An old photograph kept tucked inside a drawer. Plans for retirement. Dreams postponed until next summer. Arguments resolved. Arguments left unresolved. Promises made. Promises still waiting to be fulfilled. Every victim carried an entire lifetime that no headline could possibly summarize. When the shootings became national news, broadcasters understandably focused on the scale of the violence. Maps appeared on television screens showing the route through Whitehaven, Egremont, Seascale, and beyond. Reporters spoke about timelines, weapons, police operations, and casualty figures. Those details mattered. They helped explain what had happened. But they also created an unintended distance. It is easier to process tragedy as information than as humanity. 12 people killed. The sentence is factually correct. It is also emotionally incomplete. Those 12 people represented decades of birthdays, friendships, disappointments, achievements, ordinary mornings, family traditions, and future plans that disappeared within the space of a single morning. Behind every victim stood dozens more people whose lives would never return to what they had once considered normal. Parents who would continue growing older without their children. Children who would celebrate future milestones without a parent standing beside them. Friends who would instinctively reach for the telephone before remembering there would never be an answer again. Colleagues who would glance toward an empty chair during coffee breaks. These are the invisible victims of violent crime. They rarely appear in official casualty figures. Yet they carry consequences for years, sometimes for the rest of their lives. Communities also grieve in ways that outsiders often overlook. The loss of trust. The loss of certainty. The loss of believing that ordinary routines automatically lead to ordinary endings. Residents who had spent decades leaving front doors unlocked suddenly found themselves checking windows before bed. People who had never hesitated to stop beside a familiar vehicle now experienced an involuntary moment of caution. Parents became just a little more protective. Neighbors looked at one another with quiet disbelief, not because they feared each other, but because they struggled to understand how something so unimaginable could have emerged from a place they believed they knew so well. Trauma reshapes communities gradually. It does not always announce itself dramatically. Sometimes it appears years later in subtle habits no one consciously notices. A pause before answering an unexpected knock. A lingering glance toward an unfamiliar car. A hesitation that did not exist before. The victims of June 2nd left behind more than grieving families. They left behind an entire county learning how to live with memories it had never expected to carry. As investigators pieced together the events of the morning, they would come to understand that some victims had likely never realized they had become targets until the final seconds. Others may have had only the briefest instant to recognize danger. The randomness of those encounters became one of the defining characteristics of the case. There was no meaningful opportunity for preparation, negotiation, or escape for many of those caught in Derek Bird's path. That randomness has haunted criminologists ever since. Humans seek patterns because patterns offer comfort. If danger follows rules, then perhaps it can be avoided. But indiscriminate violence refuses to obey those rules. It ignores fairness. It disregards character. It interrupts lives already in progress. That is why remembering the victims as complete human beings matters so deeply. Violence attempts to reduce people to moments. Memory restores the years that came before those moments. Before June 2nd, every person who would lose their life that day had already lived thousands of ordinary days. They had experienced childhood, celebrated birthdays, worried about loved ones, worked through difficult weeks, laughed at jokes, made mistakes, forgiven others, and imagined futures that felt certain enough to plan. Those lives deserve to be remembered for far more than the tragedy that ended them. Because when history remembers only the violence, it allows the perpetrator to dominate the story. When history remembers the people whose lives were taken, it returns dignity to where it has always belonged. And that dignity becomes especially important now, because the next chapter will carry us into the morning itself, the point where ordinary routines begin colliding with irreversible decisions. And where the peaceful landscape of Cumbria starts transforming into a place that Britain would never forget. Before the first reports reached national headlines, before investigators began constructing timelines, before the name Derek Bird became known across Britain, the people who would become the victims of the Cumbria shootings were simply moving through their own lives. They were not characters in a tragedy. They were not symbols. They were not names waiting to appear in history books. They were people. That distinction is easy to forget when a crime becomes famous. The details of the offender often dominate public attention because people search for explanations. They want to understand the mind behind the violence. They want to know what happened, what was missed, and whether anything could have prevented it. Those questions are important. But they should never overshadow the people whose lives were taken. The victims were not placed into this story because of the shooter. The shooter entered their stories. And that difference matters. Among those who lost their lives were people whose daily routines reflected the character of the communities around them. They worked, cared for families, contributed to local businesses, maintained friendships, and filled small but essential roles in the lives of others. A community is not built by famous people alone. It is built by the people who quietly show up every day. The farmer who wakes before sunrise because animals depend on him. The professional who spends years helping others solve difficult problems. The worker who knows every customer by name. The neighbor who notices when someone has not opened their curtains in the morning. The friend who always remembers a birthday. These people are the foundation of ordinary life. And when one of them disappears, the absence is felt in places that outsiders may never see. A chair remains empty at the kitchen table. A phone number stays saved in a contact list even though it will never be answered. A favorite walking route becomes painful to visit. A familiar voice becomes something remembered rather than heard. The tragedy of the Cumbria shootings was not only measured in the 12 lives lost that day. It was also measured in the thousands of small changes that followed. Families had to rebuild routines around missing people. Friends had to learn how to speak about someone in the past tense. Communities had to find ways to continue celebrating ordinary moments while carrying extraordinary grief. Loss creates a strange relationship with time. At first, everything revolves around the moment of death. The phone call. The police announcement. The hospital waiting room. The funeral. The days immediately afterward when the world seems impossible to navigate. But eventually, the calendar continues moving. The first anniversary arrives. Then the second. Then the 5th. Then the 10th. The rest of the world gradually moves forward, but families often continue carrying the same absence. A person who was loved does not become less important simply because years have passed. In many ways, time creates new reminders. A child grows older and reaches an age their parent never saw. A grandchild is born who will only know someone through photographs and stories. A family celebration arrives with one person permanently missing. The tragedy continues in quieter forms long after the emergency vehicles leave. That is why the victims' stories matter. Not because they explain the crime, but because they remind us what the crime destroyed. The investigation into Derek Bird's actions would reveal that many of his victims had no connection to him at all. They were not part of his family disputes. They were not involved in his financial concerns. They were not participants in the conflicts that may have occupied his thoughts before the attack. They were people living ordinary lives. A cyclist enjoying the road. A driver traveling through familiar countryside. A person outside their home. Someone beginning another working day. The randomness created a particular kind of fear throughout Cumbria. It challenged the basic human belief that danger usually comes with warning. People understand arguments. They understand rivalries. They understand conflicts between individuals. But random violence feels different. It attacks the assumption that everyday behavior provides some level of protection. The victims of June 2nd were not taking unusual risks. They were not seeking confrontation. They were not expecting danger. They were simply existing in the places where their lives happened to take them. That reality makes their stories even more painful. Because there is no lesson they could have learned. No decision they could have changed. No different route they could have taken with certainty. Their lives intersected with a moment of violence that they could not have anticipated. In the aftermath, families faced the impossible task of preserving memories while accepting a future without the person they loved. Photographs became treasured possessions. Old messages became painful reminders. Personal belongings took on a meaning far beyond their practical value. A jacket hanging by the door was no longer just a jacket. A favorite mug was no longer just a mug. A handwritten note was no longer just a note. Objects become containers for memory. They hold pieces of people who are no longer there to create new memories. This is one of the quiet realities of grief that is rarely shown in news coverage. The public sees the immediate aftermath, the police statements, the press conferences, the memorials. Families experience the private aftermath. The empty rooms. The interrupted routines. The moments when instinct briefly forgets the person is gone. Someone sets the table for one more person before remembering. Someone hears a familiar sound and turns around expecting to see them. Someone begins telling a story before realizing the person who would have laughed at the ending is no longer there. These moments continue long after the world has moved on. While the public conversation surrounding the Cumbria shootings often focused on the unusual nature of the crime, those who knew the victims carried a different memory. They did not remember the day they died first. They remembered everything before it. They remembered personalities. They remembered kindness. They remembered habits. They remembered the small details that made each person unique. A person is never just the final moment of their life. That final moment may be what history records, but it is not what defines them. The same is true for every victim of violence. A life should not be measured by how it ended. It should be measured by everything that existed before the ending. For the families of Cumbria, remembering became an act of resistance against the way tragedy can erase individuality. The shootings attempted to reduce their loved ones to victims. Memory restored them as parents, siblings, friends, colleagues, and members of a community that valued them. The names associated with June 2nd, 2010, belong to people who had futures. That may be the hardest part to accept. They had plans that would never happen. Places they would never visit. Conversations they would never have. Seasons they would never experience. The loss was not only of who they were. It was also of who they might have become. Every person carries possibilities into the future. Every ordinary morning contains countless unwritten chapters. When a life is suddenly taken, those chapters disappear without ever being written. That is the true scale of loss. Not only the years already lived, but the years that should have followed. As we move closer to the events of that morning, the focus will inevitably shift toward the actions of Derek Bird and the emergency response that followed. The timeline will become faster. The decisions will become more urgent. The investigation will begin searching for answers. But before entering that darkness, it is necessary to remember the light that existed beforehand. The victims were not defined by June 2nd. They were defined by all the days before it. The mornings they woke up. The people they loved. The work they did. The kindness they showed. The memories they created. The spaces they filled in other people's lives. That is the part of their story that violence could never take away. The morning of June 2nd, 2010, did not announce itself as the beginning of a tragedy. There was no warning written across the sky. No moment when the residents of Cumbria suddenly sensed that something terrible was approaching. The landscape remained calm. The roads remained open. People continued moving through the familiar routines that had shaped their lives for years. That was what made the first moments so difficult to comprehend. The day did not begin with chaos. It began with normality. Derek Bird woke up as he had done countless times before. At 52 years old, he was a man whose life appeared, from the outside, to follow predictable patterns. He was a taxi driver who knew the roads of Western Cumbria intimately. He understood the rhythm of the towns, the places where passengers waited, and the routes that connected communities separated by countryside and coastline. For years, those roads had carried him through ordinary days. But on this morning, the journey ahead would be unlike any other. The first moments of the attack unfolded away from the public streets that would later become associated with the shootings. The violence began inside the private world of family, in the quiet spaces where personal conflicts often remain hidden from everyone outside them. Derek Bird went to see his twin brother, David. The relationship between the two brothers had existed for more than 5 decades. They had shared childhood memories, family experiences, and the unique connection of being identical twins. Yet, like many long relationships, theirs had also developed tensions over time. Disagreements involving family matters and inheritance had created strain between them. Exactly what Derek Bird was thinking during those final moments before the shootings can never be fully known. He left behind no explanation. No final conversation that answered every question. No opportunity for investigators to ask why. What remains is the sequence of events and the devastating consequences that followed. David Bird became the first victim. The news would later describe him as the first person killed in the Cumbria shootings, but that description alone cannot capture who he was. Before he became the opening chapter of a national tragedy, he was someone's brother, someone's relative, someone's familiar presence in the community. His life existed far beyond the moment when it ended. The same was true for Kevin Commons, the family's solicitor. After leaving the scene involving his brother, Derek Bird traveled to the office of Kevin Commons. The solicitor had been connected to the Bird family through legal matters, including issues involving inheritance. Like many professionals in smaller communities, Commons had built his reputation through years of helping people manage complicated personal situations. There was nothing unusual about a solicitor meeting with a client or someone connected to a legal matter. That was part of everyday life. People entered offices carrying paperwork, questions, frustrations, and concerns. They expected conversations, explanations, and solutions. They did not expect violence. But on that morning, Kevin Commons became the second person killed. Within a short period of time, a private conflict had transformed into something much larger. The attack was no longer contained within one family. It was moving outward. The transition from personal violence to public terror happened quickly. Derek Bird returned to his vehicle and began driving. The vehicle was familiar to people across the area. A taxi. Something associated with helping people reach their destinations. Something ordinary. Something that belonged to everyday life. No one seeing that taxi moving through the streets at first would have known what had already happened or what was about to happen. That is one of the most unsettling details of the case. The danger did not look like danger. It moved through the community hidden inside something recognizable. As Bird drove through the area around Whitehaven, the shootings began to expand beyond those connected to his personal life. The victims were no longer people linked by a family dispute or professional relationship. They included people who appear to have been selected simply because they were present. The randomness was terrifying. A person walking along a road. A driver behind the wheel. Someone going about a normal morning. Each became part of a chain of events that lasted approximately 2 hours but changed countless lives forever. The first emergency calls began arriving. At first, the information was confusing. A shooting. A person injured. A possible gunman. Another report from somewhere else. Then another. Emergency operators and police officers faced a situation unlike anything they had previously encountered in the area. The reports were scattered across multiple locations. The suspect was mobile. The incidents appeared connected, but the full scale was impossible to understand immediately. Modern investigations often allow authorities to reconstruct events with almost perfect clarity afterward. But inside the moment itself, there is no complete picture. There are only fragments. A frightened witness describing what they saw. A police officer receiving incomplete information. A dispatcher trying to decide which details matter most. Every second carries uncertainty. Across Cumbria, residents began noticing that something was wrong. Sirens became more frequent. Police vehicles moved through streets where they were rarely seen in such numbers. Conversations changed. People stopped asking about ordinary things and began asking questions with fear behind them. What happened? Where is he? Is everyone safe? The answer to the last question became increasingly difficult. Because Derek Bird was still moving. The geography of Cumbria shaped the unfolding crisis. The county's roads connected communities but also created challenges. Distances between towns meant that information had to travel quickly across large areas. The same countryside that gave residents a sense of peace also created places where a moving suspect could disappear temporarily from view. Bird continued driving through several locations, including Whitehaven, Egremont, Seascale, and Gosforth. The route would later be mapped in detail. The timeline would later be reconstructed. But for those living through it, there was no map. There was only fear. At each location, another ordinary scene became something else entirely. A road became a crime scene. A parking area became a place of investigation. A familiar corner became somewhere people would remember for the rest of their lives. The violence unfolded so quickly that many witnesses had only seconds to understand what was happening. Some initially struggled to accept what they had seen. The human mind is not designed to immediately process events that violate all expectations of normal life. A sound. A movement. A person falling. A sudden realization that something impossible is happening. Those moments remain frozen in memory. For survivors, the experience was not like watching a story unfold. There was no distance. No warning. No ability to pause and understand. There was only the immediate reality of danger. As the reports continued, the scale of the crisis became clearer. This was not an isolated shooting. This was a moving attack spreading across multiple communities. The police response had to adapt rapidly. Officers who began with one set of assumptions had to revise them as new information arrived. The situation was changing minute by minute. Somewhere ahead of them, Derek Bird was still on the road. Behind him were victims, grieving families, and a community beginning to understand that something extraordinary was happening. The morning that had started with people going to work, running errands, and following familiar routines had become a national emergency. And still, the final moments of the tragedy had not yet arrived. The road ahead would lead toward the remote countryside near Butte, where the search would eventually come to an end. But before that, there were more lives caught in the path of a man whose actions had transformed an ordinary June morning into one of the darkest days in modern British history. As Derek Bird continued driving through Western Cumbria, the scale of what was happening became increasingly difficult for anyone outside the immediate scenes to understand. The county was not facing a single crime scene. It was facing a moving disaster. The traditional way of responding to violence is built around a fixed location. A building. A street. A specific area where investigators can establish a perimeter, secure evidence, and begin asking questions. But the Cumbria shootings challenged that familiar approach. The danger was not confined to one place. It was traveling. Every road became a possibility. Every passing vehicle became something people noticed. Every report carried the terrifying possibility that another attack had already happened or was about to happen. For the people living through those hours, the confusion was almost as frightening as the violence itself. A person hearing about one shooting might assume the danger had passed. Then another report would arrive. Another location. Another victim. Another family suddenly pulled into the nightmare. The information came in pieces, and pieces rarely tell the full story. A witness might describe a vehicle. A caller might report hearing gunshots. A resident might mention seeing someone behaving strangely. Each detail mattered, but no single detail revealed the entire picture. Meanwhile, Derek Bird moved through a landscape he knew extremely well. That familiarity gave him an advantage that had nothing to do with planning or strategy. He was not an outsider unfamiliar with the area. He understood the roads, the villages, and the distances between places. He knew how quickly one community could disappear behind a stretch of countryside and how easily a vehicle could blend into normal traffic. For years, he had driven those roads as part of everyday life. He knew them as a taxi driver. On this day, he traveled them as the source of fear. The psychological impact of that transformation was profound. Residents were not only frightened by what had happened. They were frightened by how familiar it all seemed. The landscape had not changed. The roads were the same. The buildings remained where they had always stood. The difference was that people now associated those familiar places with something they had never imagined possible. One of the communities affected was Egremont. Like many towns in Cumbria, Egremont carried the character of a place shaped by generations of residents. Its streets were not anonymous corridors filled with strangers. People recognized faces. They remembered families. They knew which businesses had been there for decades and which homes had belonged to the same owners for years. The shooting shattered the assumption that such places existed beyond the reach of extreme violence. The same was true in Seascale and Gosforth. Communities separated by countryside suddenly found themselves connected by tragedy rather than geography alone. People who had never expected to become part of a national story were suddenly searching for information about friends, relatives, and neighbors. The questions were painfully simple. Who was hurt? Who was safe? Where is he now? Those questions repeated across homes, workplaces, and emergency service centers. For families, the waiting was unbearable. Some people learned about the shootings through television reports. Others heard rumors before official confirmation. Some received phone calls that changed their lives forever. The uncertainty created a unique kind of emotional suffering because people were forced to imagine possibilities they desperately hoped were not true. Hope and fear existed together. A person could know, rationally, that something terrible had happened and still believe their loved one might somehow be safe. The mind protects itself in those moments. It searches for alternatives. It creates explanations. It delays acceptance because acceptance feels impossible. But as more victims were discovered, the reality became unavoidable. The mourning was no longer an isolated tragedy. It was a catastrophe affecting an entire region. Among those killed during the shootings were people who had simply been traveling through their day. They were not participants in a dispute. They were not prepared for confrontation. They were ordinary residents whose paths crossed with Bird's movement through Cumbria. This randomness created a deep sense of vulnerability. A person could not look back and identify a mistake that led them there. They could not point to a decision and say, "If only I had done something differently." Many victims were simply living. That was enough. The attacks also affected people who survived. Survival can bring its own complicated emotions. Some survivors later described the shock of realizing they had lived while others nearby had not. They carried memories of moments that replayed repeatedly in their minds. The brain often returns to traumatic events, searching for a different ending or trying to understand something that initially felt impossible to process. Why did this happen? Why was I there? Why did I survive? These questions do not always have answers. The physical injuries from the shootings were only one part of the aftermath. Emotional wounds often remain invisible, appearing in memories, reactions, and fears that continue long after the immediate danger has passed. As police continued responding across Cumbria, they faced a difficult operational challenge. The suspect was mobile. The locations were spread out. The public needed information, but releasing incomplete details carried risks. Authorities had to balance speed with accuracy. A mistaken report could send officers in the wrong direction. A delayed response could allow more harm. Every decision carried consequences. Behind the scenes, emergency services worked under enormous pressure. Dispatchers managed a growing number of calls. Officers coordinated movements between different locations. Medical teams prepared for casualties. Hospitals adjusted rapidly as information about injured victims arrived. For many emergency workers, the day would remain unforgettable. Not only because of what they saw, but because of the responsibility they carried. They were entering a situation where the full danger was still unknown. They did not have the luxury of understanding the entire story before acting. They had to move toward uncertainty. That is one of the defining characteristics of emergency response. Courage is often not the absence of fear. It is action despite fear. While police searched for Bird, the wider public began receiving the first reports of what had happened. The phrase shooting spree began appearing in news coverage, a phrase that felt almost impossible when connected to Cumbria. Britain had experienced violent crimes before, but mass shootings remained extremely rare. For many people watching from other parts of the country, the story carried a strange disbelief. Cumbria, a place associated with mountains, lakes, and quiet villages. The location itself seemed to contradict the event. That contradiction made the tragedy even more shocking. Violence had not arrived somewhere already defined by danger. It had entered a place people associated with peace. As the afternoon approached, authorities began narrowing their focus toward the final stage of the search. Bird had continued moving through the countryside, eventually heading toward areas where roads became quieter and the landscape more isolated. The communities behind him were left with devastation. Families were receiving unbearable news. Investigators were beginning the difficult process of documenting what had happened. Residents were trying to understand how a normal Wednesday morning had transformed into a day of fear. And somewhere ahead, Derek Bird's journey was approaching its end. The final location would be near the village of Boot, within the wider area of the Lake District. There, surrounded by the same countryside that had defined Cumbria's beauty for generations, the man responsible for the shootings would finally disappear from the public eye. But the questions he left behind would remain. Why did he choose that day? Why did he target those people? What happened inside his mind during those final hours? Some answers would come through investigation. Others would remain permanently unknown. Because before police could question him, before a courtroom could examine his actions, and before a complete motive could be established, Derek Bird made one final decision. And with that decision, the immediate violence ended. But the search for understanding had only begun. The final stage of Derek Bird's journey led away from the busy streets and familiar neighborhoods where the shootings had unfolded and into the quieter landscape surrounding the village of Boot. The transition was striking. Behind him were towns filled with people trying to understand the unimaginable. Roads where residents had walked thousands of times had become locations marked by police activity and grief. Families were beginning the painful process of learning who had survived and who had not. Emergency workers continued moving between scenes, trying to bring order to a situation that had seemed impossible only hours earlier. Ahead of him was a different kind of landscape. Open countryside. Trees. Hills. The vast, quiet environment that had always defined Cumbria. The same natural beauty that attracted visitors from across the world now became the setting for the end of the manhunt. For officers searching for Bird, the priority was no longer simply finding him. It was preventing further harm. The uncertainty that had dominated the response remained. They did not know exactly what he intended. They did not know whether he had another plan. They did not know whether anyone else was still in danger. The only certainty was that the events of the morning had already changed countless lives. The search continued through an area where the landscape itself created challenges. Rural environments can appear open, but they can also conceal movement. Forests, hills, and uneven ground create natural barriers to visibility. A person can disappear from sight quickly, even in places that seem exposed. Police eventually located Bird's vehicle near Boot. The taxi that had carried him across Cumbria now stood silent. A vehicle that had once represented ordinary service had become one of the most important pieces of evidence in a national investigation. Inside and around that vehicle, investigators would later begin examining the physical story of the morning. Every detail mattered. Every piece of evidence could potentially help reconstruct the sequence of events and answer questions that had no easy answers. But in that moment, officers were still dealing with the immediate reality. The suspect was nearby. The search moved toward the surrounding area. Then, before police could reach him, Derek Bird took his own life. The shooting spree ended. The immediate threat was over. But there was no sense of victory. There could not be. 12 people were dead. 11 others had been injured. Families across Cumbria had already entered a reality they never expected to face. A suspect's death could stop the danger, but it could not undo the damage. It could not return parents to children. It could not restore husbands, wives, brothers, sisters, or friends. It could not erase the images witnessed by survivors and emergency responders. The end of the gunman's life was not the end of the tragedy. In many ways, it marked the beginning of another phase. The phase of questions. The phase of investigation. The phase where authorities would attempt to reconstruct not only what happened, but why. The immediate timeline was devastatingly clear. A man had started the morning within his own family circle. He had then traveled through multiple communities. He had attacked people connected to his life and people who appeared to have no connection to him at all. He had created one of the largest emergency responses Cumbria had ever witnessed. Then he was gone. But understanding the timeline was only the beginning. The deeper questions remained. What caused a man who had spent years living quietly among his neighbors to commit such violence? Were there warning signs? Could anyone have predicted what was coming? Did the people around him notice changes that only became meaningful afterward? These questions would continue to be debated for years. Investigators would discover pieces of information that helped create a picture of Bird's state of mind before the shootings. There were reports of disputes, personal grievances, financial worries, and increasing feelings of frustration. Some people who knew him described changes in his behavior. Others remembered him appearing normal in the days before the attack. The picture was complicated. And complicated answers are often the hardest for people to accept. Society naturally wants a clear explanation for extreme violence. A single cause. A single moment. A single mistake. Something that allows people to believe the future can always be predicted if the right signs are identified. But the reality of human behavior is rarely that simple. Many people experience conflict. Many people experience financial stress. Many people experience anger, loneliness, disappointment, or feelings of being misunderstood. The overwhelming majority never commit violence. The challenge in cases like Cumbria is understanding what combination of circumstances, perceptions, and decisions led one individual down a path that caused so much suffering. That understanding is important. Not to excuse. Not to justify. But to learn. Because every major criminal investigation ultimately asks two questions. What happened? And how can we prevent it from happening again? The first question can often be answered through evidence. The second is much more difficult. After the shootings, the public conversation quickly expanded beyond Derek Bird himself.